This is a recap session for Column Cymru, Unit 3, Option 8, the American Century. This session will focus on the making of a superpower from 1890 to 1990. So this is a repeat of the two sessions I've previously done. So it'll be an overview and an opportunity for you to ask any questions. So I've highlighted there the sections that you are going to cover. So that's changing continuity in US foreign policy from 1890 to 1941. Then the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War between 1941 to 75. Just to point out that the significance of détente and the end of the Cold War will be a session we'll do in the next round of Column Cymru sessions. So these are the possible questions they could ask you on this time period for the American foreign policy aspect of Unit 3, Option 8. So it could ask you about the extent of American foreign policy mainly influenced by imperialism in the period 1890 to 1929. It could ask you about the extent that American governments pursued a consistent approach to foreign policy. So there'll be ideas about imperialism, neutrality in World War I, isolationism in the 20s and 30s. It could ask you how far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in the period from 1918 to 41. They could also ask to what extent did the experience of the First World War influence US foreign policy during the period from 1917 to 41. That came up last year. So before I go into these, I'll point out, make sure you go to the previous sessions for more detail. Look at the WJEC website for revision sessions and also use classroom notes as well. So topic 1 of American foreign policy looks at the changing continuity in US foreign policy from 1890 to 1941. We'll start by looking at American imperialism in the late 19th century, the Spanish-American War, the Panama Canal, the problem of neutrality and entry into the First World War, the American contribution to victory from 1917 to 1918. Then we look at Wilson's involvement in the peace treaties and how isolationist America were in the 1920s and 30s. So to start with then, before 1890, America was very much isolationist in a sense that it didn't want to get involved with what was happening in Europe or in other continents. However, they did follow the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This stated that they would avoid European affairs unless they interfered with the Americas. So any attempts after 1823 to colonize areas of the Americas would be seen as unfriendly acts and America would be willing to step in. They also believed in something called manifest destiny. So the belief that it was their destiny to expand westwards into North America. So the first part, and what I want to point out is that I'm looking at keywords and details. So because we've already done the session in detail, this is just a recap. So like I've already explained, manifest destiny is something they believed in. It was the destiny to take the northern part of America. They also followed the Monroe Doctrine, the belief that they'd stay out of European affairs unless they interfered in the Americas. Now, there's a few motives behind why they become more imperialist in the late 19th century, so the 1890s. Some argue that it's down to social Darwinism, the belief that they're a better race of people, it's their duty to spread their religion and beliefs across the Americas. Also preclusive imperialism, the belief that it's better to take these areas rather than allow European powers to have them. Also economic motives. You'll see with Hawaii, the aim was to have a good trade link with the Pacific, with Asia. Also, you've got, when we look at Cuba, that is also a good trade link. In the 1890s, then an example of this imperialism is the annexation of Hawaii. They also acquire the Philippines after the American-Spanish War. And then under the Organic Act of 1900, they gain the territory of Puerto Rico. So the second thing you've got to cover on the specification then is the Spanish-American War in 1898. This is a territory of Spain, Cuba, and they want their independence. There's been a number of attempts at revolting. However, this was the successful one because they had the support of America. Now, they had a strong support from the US in terms of public, and also the government wanted to get involved as well. So after the USS Maine was attacked and bombed, wasn't actually something done by the Spanish, but that is something they believed. They used that as a reason to get involved. Also, sensationalist news in the yellow press published information about horrific stories about what the Spanish were doing to the Cubans. So this also stirred up public opinion in favor of supporting Cuba. Now, Congress agreed the Terror Amendment on the Declaration of War, which is an agreement that they will only go in to support Cubans' independence and then they would leave. The war lasted 4 months. It was a very easy war for America to win, and that was down to the failures of the Spanish. Now, a peace treaty signed in Paris in December 1898 recognized Cuban independence and the American annexation of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific island of Guam. So you could argue, here, like you need to have a debate in each of your paragraphs. I've got arguments that the Spanish-American War was not imperialist because they went in to support the independence of Cuba. However, by annexing Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, it suggests that this was an imperialist venture. Also, you have the US wanting to build a canal through Panama to make it easier to trade from the west to the east part of America. Now, Colombia wanted money from America, which they refused. So they gave the people of Panama their support in a revolt. When Panama then achieved independence, America accepted the deal of $10 million for this territory. Let's move on to the First World War then. So at first, the US stayed out of this war. This was down to public opinion, seeing it as not an American affair. But then neutrality became very difficult. So from 1914 to 17, when America were not involved in this war, there were still tensions with Germany. So Germany were following unrestricted submarine warfare, which did mean that American ships were attacked. Also, public opinion was then turning towards support for Britain, as they saw them as more similar to what American people were. Now, the Zimmermann telegram was sent from Germany to Mexico, asking them to declare war on the United States of America, and then they would promise them land in the southern states of America. Now, this was intercepted by the British and sent to America. Also, after giving up on unrestricted submarine warfare for a while, they then resumed this. So this made further tensions and meant that America could no longer stay out of the First World War. Now, their main strength was the contribution of money to the war. So they had more industrial strength and financial strength. They also hadn't been involved with the war for 3 years. So where morale was dying for the British and the French, they were able to give them a boost. America's powerful Navy joined the Royal Navy, so that was helpful. The American Army also contributed. So by March 1918, there were 300,000 US troops in France, and by November 1918, there were 2 million. Now, the US Army also played its part in the series of Allied offensive on the Western Front, which broke German resistance in the autumn of 1918. So it's basically a race to Paris. Those Germans coming from the Russian front back to Paris, and then America sailing over to support. Luckily, America just beat them there, and that meant the British, French, and Americans were able to win the First World War. Now, after this, Wilson's idea was always to have the main say in the peace treaties. At first, they met, they couldn't agree on everything. He did manage to get some of his 14 points into the Treaty of Versailles, but Wilson had to compromise. He did get one of his main ideas, the League of Nations, into the Treaty of Versailles. This would be all powerful countries dealing with issues before they ended up in war. Now, Congress didn't actually allow America to enter, so that was initially straight away made that League of Nations very weak. That is one of the arguments that America was isolationist in the 1920s and 30s because they rejected the League of Nations. However, you will see an opposite side of that then, that from 1924, they started to send delegates. So there are a number of reasons why America tried to become more isolationist in the 1920s. This was down to the economic downturn, also the large number of deaths that occurred in World War One, and also the Red Scare, the fear of communism. So I've got examples there that suggest maybe America were isolationist and arguments that they were not. I want you to have a look at them for a minute and decide whether the bullet points suggest they were isolationist or whether they were not isolationist. And these would have been discussed in more detail in the previous sessions. So the first one then, we have already mentioned the rejection of the League of Nations. This would be an argument that they were isolationist because they did not get involved in the League of Nations and foreign affairs. However, by sending delegates from 1924, they were having involvement. Also, the Immigration Acts would be an argument that they were becoming more isolationist by isolating themselves from the rest of the world, by not letting a large number of immigrants into the country. The Naval Disarmament Conference in Washington in 1921 would be an argument that they were not isolationist because they were still getting involved with world affairs. The Ford-McCumber tariff would suggest that they were isolationist. By putting taxes on foreign goods, they were isolating themselves from other countries because people would buy American goods instead from within America. The Dawes and Young plans, by getting involved with the events in Germany, this suggests that they were not isolationist. In Latin America, there's the argument that they never followed a policy of isolationism because of the military intervention in areas like Haiti and Nicaragua. In the 1930s, when Roosevelt became president, Congress introduced a series of neutrality acts. Now, these were an aim to stay out of foreign affairs because of the tensions in Europe and in Asia. However, you can use the Neutrality Act to give arguments that they were becoming less isolationist throughout the 1930s. So by putting a cash and carry provision, which I discussed in the previous sessions, they were allowing countries to buy things off them. So war materials, armaments, as long as they collected them themselves. And also, Roosevelt's quarantine speech in 1937 couldn't be considered as isolationist, as he talks of quarantining these countries. So he doesn't mention Nazi Germany or the Japanese Empire, but he's clearly referring to them being a danger that need to be quarantined. So that covers the first part of the American foreign policy course. And I know it's only brief, so I only use keywords and touch them lightly. The reason is the detailed sessions have been done previously. So the next part I'm going to look at then is the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War from 1941 to 75. So we look at the entry into the Second World War. We look at their involvement in the Second World War. Then we look at Cold War relations with the Soviet Union and China. And we look at the Vietnam War and its impact. So the first one I want to look at is the possible questions they could ask you on this time period. Now, they like to ask which president more successfully or effectively met the challenges of the Cold War in the period from 1945 to 75. To what extent was US policy towards communism in Asia in the years 1949 to 75 a consistent failure? And how successfully did American presidents meet the challenge of the Cold War? So from these, you need to think about these Cold War events from an American perspective. How did they deal with them? Okay. Now, again, like I said, we've looked at them in detail in the previous session when we looked at Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin Crisis. So I will touch on those in my discussion now, but you need to look back for more detail. So Franklin D. Roosevelt like I said, was not the most isolationist. He wanted to work with other countries. However, he knew that public opinion and Congress were against getting involved with foreign affairs. But when he agreed the 1939 Neutrality Act, he asked for a cash and carry provision to be put in, where he could provide arms and support to countries like Britain and France. This then went further in May 1941 with the Lend-Lease, where they no longer had to pay for it and collect it. He could lend them any means they need to survive in the war, which by May 1941, Britain and France were struggling. The Nazis had most of Western Europe. In August 1941, then, Roosevelt agreed the Atlantic Charter with Churchill, where they met in Newfoundland and agreed what the world would look like post-war with the Nazis and the Japanese. America then got involved in 1941 with the Pearl Harbor attack. So the US declared war on Japan, then Nazi Germany declared war on the US. Now, at first, Roosevelt wanted to focus on what was happening with the war in the Pacific. However, Churchill convinced him that it was important that they defeat the Nazis in order to win the Second World War. So, just mention that now. Churchill convinced Roosevelt to support in Europe, and they also supported in North Africa, which would then be a good launching point to take back Italy. The US supplied weapons and food, and one of the main things they were involved with was the Normandy invasion, where they landed on the beaches of Normandy and managed to push back the Nazis out of France. By March 1945, Allied troops had crossed the Rhine and entered Germany. They were crucial in helping Britain and France defeat the Nazis. After Hitler committed suicide in May 1945, then, the German armed forces surrendered, and then all that was left was to defeat the Japanese. So this Pacific battle was very challenging. They knew that the Japanese were not going to surrender easily, which was one of the reasons why they decided to use the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. So they did bring an end to the war in the Pacific as well then. So the next part then is the Cold War and relations with the Soviet Union and China from 1945 to 1972. Now, obviously, there have been long-term issues between America and Russia based on the ideological differences. So communism, very different to capitalism. So they did have suspicions. However, they were willing to park this for a while as they had one common enemy, which was the Nazis. So once they were defeated, then it became difficult to work together so well. So the first conference before the end of the war was the Yalta Conference in 1945. They agreed on the division of Germany. The Soviet Union agreed to support the US and Japan. However, Poland was still an issue. They wanted them to give free elections. However, they knew that Russia would be unlikely to let them be a capitalist country. Then the Potsdam Conference was very different because you no longer had Roosevelt, he died, and he was replaced by Truman, who wanted a tougher approach to communism. Still had Stalin, and then Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee. So they had continued disagreements over elections. They had agreed to divide Germany. Russia were not happy that they had to share Berlin, but this was all agreed. Then Truman was told that he would be unable to work with communism. So he introduced something called the Truman Doctrine. This was the policy of containment. So because they believed in the domino theory that if one country falls to communism, the others fall as well, then this policy would stop that happening. Now, in order to prevent communism spreading across Europe, he introduced the Marshall Plan, which was to give economic aid to European countries to stop them falling to communism. Now, one of the key events in the early years of the Cold War was the Berlin blockade, when Stalin had heard of America, France, and Britain discussing joining their zones, he became very annoyed at these secret talks, and he decided to block access to the western part of Berlin, so America were unable to get resources to West Berlin because they would have had to travel through the eastern part of Germany. However, the Americans decided not to give up on Berlin like Stalin thought they would, so they managed to fly in resources to make sure West Berlin remained a capitalist country and part of the American, British, and French zones. So that was a success for America when Stalin decided not to continue this then. China and Japan then, you have China fall into communism in 1949 under Mao Zedong. America tried to stop this. And also, Japan had been treated badly by the Americans because they wanted their revenge. However, after China fell to communism, America realized they needed to support Japan in their recovery to make sure that communism didn't spread from China and Japan. Korean War, that's another reason why. So we've got another example of America trying to stop the spread of communism. So North Korea invaded South Korea. America then stepped in to support and take the North Koreans back and push them to the 38th parallel. Now, the general in charge actually went further than he was meant to, so he was fired by Truman, which led to many people in America thinking he was going too soft on communism. Then, after 3 years of stalemate from 50 to 53, they agreed to end the Korean War in the same place that it had been previously. So even though they didn't remove communism from North Korea, it did stop the spread, which again is another success for containment. In 1961 then, Germany built the Berlin Wall because of the drain of people from East Berlin and East Germany through to the West. So that then calmed the situation until the Cuban Missile Crisis then. After the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion, when Kennedy tried to remove Fidel Castro, Castro turned to Russia for support, and Russia attempted to put missiles on Cuba. Now, America were able to stop that, but this was the closest point that they'd come to nuclear war. So this actually calmed the situation then because they realized how dangerous it got. Now, obviously, I've covered these briefly. If you look at the other sessions, they're in a lot more detail. And the final part of this then is Vietnam War and its impact. Now, another reason why they've got involved in this, again, is the domino theory, the belief that they need to contain communism. If they allow South Vietnam to fall to communism, then it will spread to Laos, Cambodia, and other areas of Asia. So the Viet Cong were fighting for Vietnamese reunification. They began their campaign in 1959 in South Vietnam, using a mixture of terrorist attacks against government targets and recruiting people to their cause. So at first, the US sent money, weapons, and then advisors to support the South Vietnamese government. They tried to round them up into hamlets. Obviously, things like this, removing the South Vietnamese people from their own land, did not help South Vietnamese support for America. So 2 incidents in August 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin led to escalated US involvement. These were used by the US to justify military involvement in Vietnam. So Congress gave President Johnson the power to use the US military to prevent South Vietnam and its neighbors like Cambodia and Laos from becoming communist. Now, this led to a massive buildup of US forces in South Vietnam. Now, American tactics like search and destroy, so destroying whole villages and maybe not finding any Viet Cong and not killing any enemies, made them hated. They also used Operation Rolling Thunder to try and stop trade links, routes for the North Vietnamese to bring them down to the south. However, this didn't have much impact, just made the South Vietnamese people hate the Americans more. And they also used chemical weapons like Agent Orange and napalm, which were used to destroy the trees so they could see through. However, again, when this was landing on people, it was horrific. And this is the first real war that was televised. So people back home in America were seeing this. And it meant a loss of support for what was happening. They didn't, it was too far away for them to think they needed to be involved with this. Viet Cong also carried out a very successful guerrilla campaign. So they used tactics which were effective. So underground tunnels, booby traps, and anything else that would allow them to take out American soldiers. This war was becoming a huge cost, money and lives, and lost Johnson a lot of support. So Nixon was then elected on the promise that he would move out of Vietnam. So he did gradually remove the military involvement. The US continued to provide support to South Vietnam, but in 1975, the Army of North Vietnam completely overran the South, and Laos and Cambodia did fall to communism, which does suggest that there is some truth in that domino theory. But in terms of how effective was American foreign policy in Asia, when you're looking at the Vietnam War, you could argue that it was extremely ineffective. So that covers the key content very briefly that I had gone through in the previous sessions. So if you need to look at those in more detail, go through part A and part B to cover all that in a longer time span. Thank you.